All right, back for the second week in a row. So we have our very special guest, Adriano, joining us again this week to talk about a new feature that is very focused on AWS and S3 access. So, Adriano, we talk a lot about how Border0 is designed to balance that sort of convenience and efficiency with security. One of the main challenges that pops up in real life is when you need to grant temporary access to someone outside of your organization. And today, there's not really a convenient way to do that in AWS.
Yeah, exactly. It's not uncommon that you'll need to grant temporary access to someone that is not part of your engineering team or even folks
Hmm.
outside of the company altogether. Like, let's
Hmm.
say a SOC 2 auditor might need read only access for 2 weeks to your AWS environment, or a contractor might need to upload a few files to an S3 bucket, so they need access just for a few hours.
Hmm. Okay, so how would you do it today?
Yeah, so IAM is very hard, and in
Yeah,
particular, if you want to provide short-lived access for a few days, or maybe even shorter, maybe a couple hours, right?
yeah.
Especially for folks that don't already exist in your identity provider.
Hmm.
There's not an easy way to do that with AWS IAM. What ends up happening is you either end up creating static IAM users with static
Hmm.
credentials, and you have to deal with all the issues that come with static credentials, like credential sprawl, making sure you scope the credentials right, and you have to remember to revoke them later, right?
Hmm.
So that's option number one. The other
Okay.
option is you figure out how to add this contractor or this third party person to your identity provider. And this is a significant amount of effort, right? You end up spending a couple hours giving someone access just to a week from now spend a couple hours more revoking that access.
Oh, what a pain. So you're basically building the house just to tear it down later, and you got to remember to do it. Otherwise, you've built in some risk, right? Um,
Exactly.
so so what do we do differently?
Yeah. So with Border0, we wanted to build a better way. I think we've achieved that. You can now give someone short-lived audited access to the AWS console without creating any IAM users, without static credentials, and without adding them to your identity provider. You simply invite them to your Border0 organization, you add them to the right Border0 policy, and make sure they have access to the right AWS access socket.
All right, cool. Can you show us what it looks like?
So once you navigate to the socket's URL, you will be prompted to authenticate to the Border0 organization using the identity providers that your administrator has allowed for you. Once we've done that, we can see all accounts we have access to, as well as roles we have access to within each of these accounts. From here, we can click on the account and role that we want, and we will be redirected to the AWS console with temporary session credentials. And once you're in the AWS console, you can go ahead and get your stuff done. And for administrators, the UX is just as simple. Setting up console access requires only a few steps. First, you should deploy a Border0 connector. For this demo, I've already pre-provisioned a connector in one of my AWS accounts. It's this one here, Border0 Dev AWS NorCal. Next, you should create a Border0 socket of type AWS access. So if you go to sockets, add new socket, search for AWS, you'll see the AWS access socket. Go ahead and create. Here is where you will define your socket's configuration. First, how the connector will authenticate against AWS. In my case, the connector is running in an EC2 instance in my AWS account, so I want the connector to use its runtime role through the default credentials provider chain. Second, you will define what specific accounts and roles the socket should grant access to. Once we do that, we can go ahead and attach the connector, in my case, AWS NorCal, and go ahead and create the socket. Now, I've already pre-created a socket for this demo, so let's go look at the configuration for that one. It's this one, titled AWS Demo. It has 4 roles across 3 accounts configured, a read-only role in each of the accounts, and an administrator role in this account, which we've called Development. Note also that in the sockets page, there's an IAM policy generator. For your convenience, this will generate an IAM policy document that you can attach to your connector's IAM role to ensure that it can issue temporary credentials for the roles that you've defined in the socket. The final step in configuring AWS access through Border0 is to define who can have access to what roles through this particular socket. We do this through Border0 policies. I have one policy called Allow All that allows access to both my corporate email and my personal email to have access to the 3 read-only roles, while I have a different policy called AWS Write Access that only grants access to my corporate email to have access to the administrator role. So the end result should be that my personal email only has access to the 3 read-only roles, while my corporate email has access to the 3 read-only roles, plus the additional administrator role in the development account. Let's go ahead and verify that that is true. So let's go back to our socket here, and I'm logged in with my corporate email, and so I should have access to all 3 read-only roles and additionally the administrator role in the development account. And if we try to log in with my personal email, we should not see that administrator role that we saw when I logged in with my corporate email. And as usual, you can use Border0 sessions to see who accessed which roles, when, and from where. And one thing that is noteworthy is if you log in through the AWS Access socket, your AWS session will include your Border0 identity in the sessions identifier so that you can use AWS CloudTrail to track what happened within your AWS environment for each session issued by Border0.
Cool. So that solves the AWS console problem. But what if someone doesn't really need access to the console? They need access to an S3 bucket.
Yeah, so normally the still pain points would apply. You'd still have to give them AWS access. And again, if they're not already in your identity provider, like we talked about earlier, that's hurdle
Hmm.
number 1. Hurdle number 2
Okay.
is you have to make sure not to over provision access, right? With AWS IAM being such a rich, flexible language that's scoped to the entirety of AWS, it's easy to, accidentally give access not only to S3, but let's say RDS or DynamoDB, right? Other services. And even within
Ooh.
S3, it's easy to give access, over provision access and give access to buckets and objects that you did not intend to give access to.
Yeah.
So that's hurdle number 2. And again, you have to remember to revoke the access later, which doesn't always
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And I mean, all of us, if you go to the AWS console right now, you go to roles or you go to users, you'll see so many, right? It'll be hard to keep track
Yeah.
and remember to go and delete the right thing.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just not what you want to be focused on. That's like busy work kind of a thing. So, all right. So what do we do to tackle this problem?
Yeah, so we built the AWS S3 socket type, which ties access to specific S3 buckets to Border0 policies without ever creating
Hmm.
any IAM resources in AWS. And then that's from the admin perspective. And then users can still use whatever client they're used to, whether it's the AWS CLI or the various AWS SDKs,
Hmm.
or even better, our beautiful S3 file browser that we've baked in directly into the client portal.
All right. I can't wait to see it. So I am curious though, how granular can you get with the permissions?
Very granular. Why don't I show you exactly what it looks like for an admin to set this up?
Great.
So over here in the Border0 admin portal, I can tweak my policy to allow access to S3. And in this example, I'll give myself read-only access to buckets prefixed with Adriano-star. And you can get really flexible here. You can give list, read, write, or delete access to specific objects within specific buckets. You can have multiple rules per policy even. Maybe you want to allow read-only access to all buckets, but read-write access only to one specific bucket. I'd say the language is as granular as AWS IAM, but with
Hmm.
a much simpler policy language since it's only scoped to S3 and not all of AWS.
Yeah, this looks really straightforward for the admin. But let's go back to that user experience. So maybe it's a non-technical user. What does it look like for them?
Yeah, let me show you. So over here in the client portal, we can click on our S3 socket and browse the S3 bucket's contents. We can list, read, write, and delete files as we normally would in the AWS console. And why don't we put our policy to the test a bit? So remember, I gave myself read-only access to this particular bucket. Why don't we try deleting something, which should fail?
Hmm.
There we go. It failed. And why don't we try also uploading something, which should also fail? Yep, it failed too.
All right. And all of this activity that you're doing is recorded, right?
Yes, you get all the usual Border0 benefits, including session recording, so you have the ability to see exactly what someone did. Why don't we take a look at that session I just did, actually? If we go over here to the admin portal and the session logs tab, and we click on the session that we just did, we can see every request's bucket, object, and whether it was allowed or denied by policy. Here you can see the 2 denied requests, the one to upload and the one to delete.
Cool. I love it. This is so easy to use and we just, yeah, much better UX. So, all right. So I guess if you've ever had to provision a short-term access for AWS console to a contractor, an auditor, a non-engineer, and thought there has to be a better way to do this, now there is.
Exactly. You can provide short-lived access without static credentials. You get the full visibility and session recording that you're used to with Border0, and it's just an all-around better, easier user experience.